Today, it's our honor to have a Professor Harry Harding to join us to give us a very specific speech. Why should I say it's specific? Especially, I think it's very specific for the College of Social Science. Um, I personally knew Professor Harry Harding in, oh my God, 1990s, in late 1990s. At the moment, I remember in Washington D.C., he was remember he was famous in Chinese economic reform, and he was also good at to analyze cross relations. But today, the topic he gave us is a complex legacy. Sorry, that is a little bit long. The complex legacies of fallen empires, and these empires covered British Empire, Rome Empire, Russia, and China. In other words, this is of history and even a very important human history perspectives about, especially I believe in the end, you will definitely focus on the China, your specific part. So, in other words, today he's gonna give us a grand view about, especially in this current event when we are seeing PRC, PLA is surrounding the Taiwan at this moment when people are talking about the current situation. But Professor Harry Harding is gonna bring us a different view. So today, let's welcome Professor Harry Harding to give us a speech. However, in the very beginning, let me introduce our Dean Yang, Professor Dean Wang Yang.
Good afternoon, Professor Harding and Shelley and Professor Len and Guan and many our honored guests and students. Good afternoon. I'm Wang Yin-Yang, the Dean of College of Social Science. Our host today, the moderator today, is Associate Dean of our College of Social Science, Philip Liu. Thank you for his very opening this section with a memory, a very interesting memory, the encounter in the US. And today I'm going to give a more formal introduction to our Yushan Scholar, Professor Harry Harding. And I know many of you have been familiar with Harding. He's a big name, big shot. And I often run into some international IR scholars. They all told me that they read Harding's book while they were students, and now they are scholars. And Harding's books, I know many of you less acquainted with Dr. Harding, but he is the renowned scholar in Asia politics and the U.S. China relations. And he earned his PhD from Stanford University. And among his notable publications are A Fragile Relationship, China and Northeast Asia, China's Second Revolution, and Organizing China. And his influential work has significantly impacted policymakers and scholars around the globe. And currently, Professor Harding is a university professor emeritus of public policy and a faculty senior fellow at the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia. He has previously held many prestigious positions. And from 2009 to 2014, he was a founding dean of UVA's Fred Britton School of Leadership and Public Policy. Before that, he taught at the Swarthmore College and Stanford University and was a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Between 1995 and 2005, he served as a dean of the Eliot School of International Affairs at the George Washington University. Beyond academic, Dr. Harding has played a significant role in real-world politics. From 2005 to 2007, he was director of research and analysis at the Euro-Asia Group, a political risk research and advisory firm in New York. He has served on the board of various educational and nonprofit institutions, as well as on the U.S.-China Joint Commission on Science and Technology and the U.S. Defense Policy Board. Dr. Harding has briefed several U.S. presidents on China, and has been invited to Camp David for advisory discussions. And since 2018, today we are very honored to have Harding to give us a talk here. Because since 2018, we at College of Social Science, NCCU, had the tremendous honor of welcoming Professor Harding to be our chair professor. At the same years, he was appointed as Yushan Scholar, the highest honor award by Taiwan's Ministry of Education, to enhance the country's academic reputation globally by bringing leading experts and researchers to cooperate with Taiwanese university. This year marks the 7th year and the second term of your Yushan Scholar co-working and cooperation with NCCU. And thank you, Harding. And also, I want to thank for Professor Lin and Professor Kwan's introduction, our UVS alumni. Without their introduction, we didn't get access to the big guy and the from US. Okay. So today's talk, just as Philip just mentioned, it's very interesting. I think many of you probably expect something about US-China relations, but Harding particularly want to give you something else and more than US-China relations. Okay, the foreign title is a complex legacy of foreign empire, from Rome to Britain and from Russia to China. Well, we all know in a more distant history that Roman Empire and British Empire have played a significant role and influenced the civilization along the globe for lasting past and till today. But we are nowadays witness the rising empire, the rising China, and the Russia from the Soviet Union to today. And today we are very eager and look forward to Harding's going to give us a talk from a comparative and historical perspective to this from the fallen to the rising empire. And let's welcome Professor Harding. Thank you.
Well, my thanks to all of you for coming, and my thanks both to Dean Yang and Professor Liu for very kind and overly generous introductions. Let me say that what you've heard from them is some points in my, a kind of a long and diverse career, which is just another way of saying that I'm getting damned old. So lots of experiences to share with my students, and maybe some of which I will be able to share with you today. But I think the most important thing that I'm sure that you probably knew before, but was certainly reinforced by these kind introductions, was that what I'm going to present to you today, even though I do have a script, it's not going to be something I'm going to read, because this is a work that is very much in progress. And that is because it's a new topic for me, something I've never worked on before. I am seen as a specialist on China, on domestic policy and foreign policy in China over the years, especially in the Mao and post-Mao periods, a specialist on US-China relations, and I teach courses here on US-Taiwan relations, which is of increasing interest to me. But this is a new topic. And so I thought that I might begin in introducing these, I don't even want to call it a lecture, this talk today, is to tell you a little bit about how I developed this topic. And it is going to go back a while in my life, actually to my boyhood. And I'll give you some points of time that I think really did shape my thinking about this. Before we do that, however, I think it's first important to say a few words about what do we mean by an empire. It's kind of obvious, but let's just clarify what we mean. Empires are political and economic relationships between a powerful country, sometimes it's called the metropole or the imperial center, the imperial capital, and smaller or weaker societies or countries or territories where that powerful center exercises a degree of control, sometimes tighter, sometimes looser, over those subordinate territories, mainly in the interests of the empire and the metropole itself. That, I think, is pretty obvious. What we also have to keep in mind, however, is that there are two broad categories of empire. There are formal empires and there are informal empires. Formal empires are empires that call themselves that. Think of the British Empire, the Roman Empire, the Chinese Empire, the Japanese Empire, and the list goes on. And there are empires that do not consider themselves to be empires, but are informal empires. These are empires that exercise a very large degree of control, but do not necessarily have the same range of authority or the same number of formally subordinate entities that the larger empires do. So we can talk about, and I'm not shy about talking about it, the American empire, especially because many people are talking about the decline of the American empire for very good reasons. So we can talk about formal empires, informal empires, empires of the past, empires of the present, empires of the future. And today I'm going to talk mainly about not just the rise and fall, but also suggest the survival through adaptation of a relatively small number of these empires. And I'm delighted to see so many people here today that not only come from different academic backgrounds, but as I look at where they're coming from, some of them are coming from products of former empires or even members of these more informal, adapted current empires. So with that as a common definition, let me say a few things about how I developed an interest in this topic, and then introduce the presentation itself. As I've thought about it, obviously the more I work on it and think about it, the more thoughts come into my mind from longer and longer time periods back. So let me go back to some time, and I can't really even give you a date, but it was probably sometime in the 1950s when I was growing up in New York City, and there I felt very strongly that I was living in the center of an informal American empire. Nobody called it that at that time, but after all, I was living in the city that was the home to the United Nations, had a beautiful new building along the Hudson River, not far from where I lived at that time. And also in many other ways, the United States was the center of many of the activities that informal empires undertake, especially in terms of softer power, popular culture in particular. This was the center of world broadcasting, both for news and for entertainment. It was the center of one of the most important musical forms. And Shirley and I went to a conference last night in Hong Kong by Wynton Marsalis, who may not be a name that's familiar to you, but what he leads is the Lincoln Center Jazz Orchestra. So jazz is certainly a name that you'll know. And this is where the United States, and maybe particularly New York, was where jazz was developed from roots further in the southern part of the United States. And that was a key cultural part of American influence. It was a particular influence to people in the Soviet Union who were fascinated by it. It was so different from what was permitted there and what was the official Soviet style of music. So I grew up in that setting of feeling that I was in the center of the world. I'll give you one specific story of the kind of the narrative that young people like me either were told or grew up with. There was one year, can't remember what year it was, but I was in grade school, and it was United Nations Day, the day every year that everybody celebrates the birth and evolution of the United Nations. And all the kids in my primary school class were cast to be representatives of the United Nations, and each got to wear that national flag as a kind of a costume. For whatever reason, my parents told me it was because I was the youngest kid in the class. What that meant for this purpose, I have no idea. but I was chosen to be the United States. So I got to wear the American flag, the U.S. flag, as my costume for that day. But less important than that was what the role was that I was cast to play. And that is that everybody, all my classmates, came out on stage, each wearing a different costume. Most of them, of course, were Western countries, European, not very many independent countries in Africa yet, even in South Asia, let alone Southeast Asia. So mainly Northern, Western, Eastern, and Southern European countries. And basically what happened was they all stood on the stage, and I went around going bang, 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 bang. That was World War II. And all of them that I shot fell down on the floor. And then I went over, and one by one, I picked them back and put them back up on their feet. And that was the view of America's role in those years, as basically the savior of at least the European world, and especially the Western European world, from World War II, and then continuing to protect it, of course, from the Soviet Union and communism. So that was my view of the world, and it was a very dramatic visual example of what it meant to be in the center of an informal empire. Now I say informal because there were formal parts to the American empire, though we never called it an empire, as I said. And these would be the various alliances that we had, obviously a large array of economic and social and cultural relationships, obviously a whole panoply of relationships other than being the center of the United Nations system. And once I moved to Washington, I saw the center of the Bretton Woods economic order as well. If the United Nations was based in New York, then the World Bank and the IMF were based in Washington, D.C. And of course, the Pentagon and the CIA, other parts of this broadly defined American informal empire, were just across the Potomac River. So I basically lived the evolution of the American informal empire, and most importantly, of course, saw the beginning of the decline of that empire during the Vietnam War, which was the first period where you had a sense that this empire might weaken, might fall, or would have to be readjusted to accommodate some very important changes in the ways in which other parts of the world thought about things and the level of power that they had. So those are the kinds of things that I want to talk about today under that kind of broad conceptual framework. I know it's kind of very, very broad, and maybe many of you might disagree with aspects of it, which is fine. But let me, having set out that background, what do we mean by an empire, and distinguishing between formal and informal, let me also then talk a little bit about this idea of rise and fall, and introduce one additional concept. Oh, not?
It's already on.
Oh, this is already on?
Yeah.
Not really, but if I have to, I will. Okay, are we on now?
Yes.
We are, okay, because I can't really hear a difference. But anyway, let me talk about, or give an introduction or a structure for the talk. I think you're all familiar with the idea of the rise and fall of empires. This, of course, goes back to Gibbon's classic history of the Roman Empire, which was called The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire. And the idea is that some societies develop the resources. You can define it as economic, as military, as technological, as cultural, and develop the will and the confidence and the determination to create these empires, whether formal or informal. Then the idea is that empires begin to somehow decay, to erode, and may actually collapse, as Rome did. One of the people who has really helped me understand this is a good friend of Shirley and mine at the University of Virginia, a historical sociologist named Yushan Scholar, who has written what I now consider the standard work on comparative empires. And what he has taught me is not only about the rise and fall and evolution of empires, but also the fact that when empires decay and fall, it is very rarely primarily from domestic circumstances. It is primarily from the external environments in which they operate. This is largely because they are so powerful that generally they can handle any unrest within the borders of the empire proper, but they often are overextended when it comes to defending their borders or their subsidiary units, their dependencies from various kinds of external factors. So basically, the process of the decline and fall of empires, Krishan tells us, can begin from outside. That's usually the area that weakens them the most. And think about the barbarians attacking Rome. You can talk about the West infringing on the Chinese Empire. You can talk about the Vietnam War weakening the United States, World War II ending the Japanese Empire. And these are examples of the way the outside plays a very important role in the decline. The fall, if it comes from inside, I think it begins to show up in the loss of will. I mentioned that countries and states, societies that become empires have both the resources, the economic, the technological, the military, sometimes the cultural power to influence others and gain control over them. But I think equally important is the will to do so, the desire to do so, the commitment to do so. And if the cost of empire becomes greater and greater, then the willingness to pay that price begins to decline. And so some empires weaken for that reason. And then there can be, I think, with all respect to my friend Krishan, who I have to thank for encouraging an amateur like me to take this subject on, this does represent another factor in why empires decline and may even fall. But I also want to introduce another noun to my title, and that is that empires do not only rise and fall, but they also, some of them surprisingly, survive. They survive because they adjust and they adapt. And we'll mention a few of these as we go along, but let me simply highlight a couple of them. And this will also illustrate to you another set of influences on me personally, and that was the chance to visit, along with my wife Shirley, who is always my greatest critic and my greatest supporter, some of the products of empire. We have visited together a number of countries in Western and Eastern Europe, including the Baltic states. We have been to Vietnam. We've obviously been to China. We live on Taiwan, which is a product of the Japanese Empire. And in all of these ways, we have seen, we just came back from Hong Kong, as I said, to hear that concert by Wynton Marsalis earlier this morning. And in all these ways, we just keep seeing and hearing things from conversations or looking visually at the legacy that empires leave behind. But we're also reminded of how empires can evolve and adjust. Perhaps the first example of this was the creation of something, and I have to here thank my course assistant, Ben Fioravanti, from Italy, of course, the origin of the Roman Empire, and has helped me understand the evolution of the Roman Empire, the attempts by Mussolini to recreate the Roman Empire. And what we saw in the kind of the declining years of the of the first Roman Empire was the creation of something called the Eastern Roman Empire. This was a way of bringing the greater wealth and therefore the greater security of the area around Byzantium, now known as Istanbul, to add to the strength of the Western Roman Empire, and it kept it going for a number of years until it became first the Byzantine Empire and then, of course, the headquarters of the Ottoman Empire. And that was another thing that I remember from our fairly recent trip to Turkey, was to see and visit Istanbul or Byzantium, or Constantinople. It's had many names, and many of those names reflect the fact that that one city has been the metropole for many different empires. And so that gave us an opportunity to think about how many are there? What's the differences? What are the similarities between these different empires? How did they rise? How did they weaken? And how did they fall? And have any of them survived in any particular way? So as I just said, the Western Roman Empire survived for a bit longer by giving equal status to the Eastern Roman Empire, basically therefore saying we need your support and therefore we're going to give you equal status with us. Another probably well-known example, and actually there are several versions of the Roman Empire that were based in Byzantium, Istanbul. There was also something called the Latin Empire, which I'm sure that nobody has ever heard of except for Ben. But there were a number of kind of follow-ons from the Roman Empire that reflected this adjustments, this adaptation, and the ways in which empires would fall apart, would survive in some different form. Another very well-known example is the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which merged two empires, the Austrian Empire and then the Hungarian state, and basically for the same reason, that Austria was weakening and Hungary was demanding a greater say in the conduct of the empire, and so the empires were merged under a common emperor. So that one adjusted as well and lasted, again, a bit longer, not forever. Probably the best example of adjustment is what happened to the British Empire, and that is the British Commonwealth, which indicates again that when empires begin to weaken, this may not be directly for external reasons, but it does suggest that internally there is a declining willingness to resist those external pressures under the domestic governing structures and power allocations within the empire. And so basically, the Austrians began to realize, because the Hungarians were pushing them hard, if you want our participation and support, you need to give us equal status. So just as Byzantium got equal status with Western and Rome and became the Eastern Roman Empire, so did Hungary get equal status with Austria and became a co-equal part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So empires rise, empires fall, but some empires adapt. And the adaptation may be a sharing of political power. It may be a more equal or more equitable distribution of the economic benefits of empire. And so some empires adjust and survive for a bit longer. Even the British Commonwealth, however, is undergoing strain, largely because the equivalent of the postmodern emperor, Queen Elizabeth II, who held this all together, passed away. Her son, Charles III, is now the head of the empire and is either the head of state or head of government of a surprising number of countries that are part of that empire. But we see that even there, when the leadership changes, things begin to get weaker. The will begins to decline. And is anybody here from Australia? Too bad. We need more people as part of our new southbound strategy to come from Australia. King Charles is about to make his first royal visit to Australia, where he is the head of state, actually holds the title King of Australia, just as he holds the title King of Canada. And the prime ministers of the separate states within Australia have refused to go and meet him, saying that he is not an elected head of state. They are all apparently Republicans. They therefore will not grace his presence with their presence. Fortunately for the monarchy, there are not only prime ministers, but there are governors in each of the Australian states who are the direct representatives of the King of Australia. So they will go and meet him. And so this diplomatic and internal political crisis seems to have been averted, but it does indicate that even the Commonwealth, as successful as it has been, and how many countries that King Charles is still the head of government of, this still may not survive until the end of time. So, with that as an introduction, let me talk a little bit more about the rise and the fall of the empires. Maybe not so much the rise and fall for the sake of time. I think I've said enough about that. But let me get into the what I call the complex legacy of these empires. I think that there's been insufficient attention to this subject until quite recently. Scholars have been primarily writing the kind of follow-ons to Gibbon's book, The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire. We've seen books on the rise and fall of the Third Reich, the Third German Empire. The Second Empire was the one that collapsed, again under external pressure at the end of World War I. And there was one, the First German Empire was a kind of combination of states, which also indicates how that can be a structural weakness of empires, although that empire kind of morphed into the Second Empire. What I want to talk about is the more complicated legacy of the empires that survived longer. We've been talking primarily from the point of view first of the imperial center, from the creators and managers of empire. And of course, as long as they still controlled the dependent territories and still were well represented in the imperial or the metropolitan center, that was a very positive view. And all of us who have lived in Hong Kong, is anybody here from Hong Kong or lived in Hong Kong? Yep. So we'll be able to tell us about how basically the history of Hong Kong was taught. It was the glory of empire. Chinese history was taught only in the distant past, if at all, and it was all about the empire, about Britain. One of the most important legacies is in names. What are things called? And coming back from Hong Kong yesterday, and we, of course, traveled here and there as visiting one of the places that we call home, we saw all the nomenclatural, the name legacy, none of which has been changed since the handover to the Chinese. So you arrive from the airport in a tunnel through what is still Victoria Harbor. You then drive to our home, which is basically passes by Victoria Park, which is the most important public park. The headquarters of the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, another imperial institution, is on Queen's Road Central. It still is called Queen's Road. We took a subway ride on the wonderful British legacy infrastructure of the MTR. Keep happening to remember it's not the MRT there, it's the MTR, and went by Prince Edward, named after a son, the heir apparent of one of the English kings. And we could have gone past Queen Elizabeth Hospital. We could have gone past King George's School. We could have gone past Prince Charles. Is there a Prince Charles Hospital? The Prince of Wales Hospital. Very few names have been changed. About the only ones that I can think of are the following. There may be more. One was that the most important civil society institution in Hong Kong was and is the Jockey Club, which of course is the organization that conducts horse racing and betting on horse racing in the wonderfully named in Chinese, it's simply the horse racing place. Saimao Hui, I guess it was, or the Saimao, right? A competitive place for racing horses, but it has the wonderful English name of Happy Valley, suggesting that if you made money betting, you'd be very happy. So it was called Happy Valley. And the Royal Hong Kong Jockey Club was also one of the most generous philanthropic organizations in Hong Kong. When the handover occurred, then some of the royal names, the royal charters, were revoked. So the Hong Kong Jockey Club became the Jockey Club. The Hong Kong police became simply the police force, or simply now it's just called the force. You don't have to be told what it is. But some have resisted. Most famously to me is the Royal Hong Kong Yacht Club, which has refused to change its name, except in Chinese. So in Chinese, it is now simply the Yacht Club, but it is in English still the Royal Hong Kong Yacht Club, and they are stubbornly refusing to change it. How long they can do that, who knows, but it's interesting. Singapore has gone through another transition. Also, a lot of the colonial names of streets in particular have remained unchanged. The architecture is still there. But the Royal Singapore Yacht Club found an also clever solution. They simply changed it to Republic of Singapore Yacht Club, so the initials remain totally unchanged. So adjustments are made even when things change. In the United States, we had a revolution. The seal of the state of Virginia, Commonwealth of Virginia, shows the symbol of Virginia, a young lady kicking down on the ground the King of England, Charles III, knocking off his crown with the Latin slogan, Sic semper tyrannis, so it is with tyrants. And that is the symbol of the American Revolution. Relatively little changed. Other than that, yes, statues of King George were taken down in many places, and a few pieces of architecture may have been changed in addition. But I'm always struck about how little otherwise changed. The Commonwealth of Virginia, as it's now called, as opposed to the Virginia colony, is now every one of its counties, or many of them, maybe even more in Maryland, are named after various British aristocrats or members of the royal family. We live in Albemarle County, which is named after the Earl of Albemarle, whose descendant, the current Earl of Albemarle, runs a very posh men's fashion store and design center in London. So the Albemarle still exists, as does Albemarle County. Our city, Charlottesville, is named, like Charlotte, North Carolina, after the King of George III, and that name was not changed. The only name that I can think of that's been changed is the name of what is now Columbia University, which was called King's College. That name was changed. Queens College was not changed. King's College was not changed. The province of, the borough of Brooklyn, of the Bronx is Kings County. None of that was changed. But Columbia was changed, excepting for the name of its radio station, which is still WKCR, King's Crown Radio, and of course the publishing house. There is a Columbia University Press, but for many years it was called King's Crown Press. So even there, the changes were minimal. So when empires leave a legacy, it is often names, pieces of architecture, as well as various institutions, styles of governments, and kinds of economic institutions. They may have a longer survival. But again, the long-term question is whether their value is continues to have the same weight that it did when the empire fell and those rather minimal changes were made. So that brings me to more about these legacies of empire. It's first of all the architecture. A few buildings have been torn down. Perhaps the best example, because of its symbolic importance and why it was torn down, was what would be called in a British system government house, basically the Governor General's house in Seoul, Korea, which was built by the Japanese very deliberately to go right across the north-south axis of the city of Seoul, that led from the south up through a main gate to basically the imperial palace or the royal palace of the Korean monarchs. That was torn down and was replaced by the Governor General's government house, as the British would call it, simply putting a mark, a physical barrier across the north-south axis of the city. And you can see what a symbolic importance that was. We are in charge now. The Japanese are in charge. That was torn down as a result of that. Relatively few other buildings that I'm aware of were torn down, although some may have been very interested in the examples that others can give me. The grand capital of colonial, or I should say imperial India, New Delhi, designed by a very famous British architect, was simply kept in place, but basically everything was changed to a new function. So the viceroy's residence became the president's residence. There was a new center for the parliament because the other one was simply too small. It was part, I believe, of the government house. Everything else remains the same, as were so many of the military traditions. If you ever want to see the real Bengal Lancers, the famous cavalry troop of the British Empire, just try to go to India on National Day. And there you will see in their old uniforms the entire rank of the British Army in India, including the Bengal Lancers, mounted with their lances. None of that has changed at all. They still have the British imperial names for the regiments. Still, the uniforms have been modified somewhat, but look very similar for the officers. These troops are all in their traditional regimental uniforms. None of that is changed. And basically, the impact of the Raj, the British Empire on India, is still extraordinarily strong. So some things go, some things change, names changed, some policies change, some buildings change. But these legacies, these physical legacies, can be very enduring. Even more important are some of the cultural legacies. One of the most interesting to me is the legacy of the imperial language. This we see all the time in Hong Kong, where it is technically, of course, a bilingual society. And many of my favorite stores are called the Anglo-Chinese this or that. English is still widely spoken, including by taxi drivers. The app for calling a cab, you can simply press if you want, that says English only, meaning you will only speak in English. And you will have a driver that is able to talk to you in English, understand everything you say. It is a bilingual society. So the language remains very, very strong. In Japan and Taiwan, some remnants of Japanese. It's still a popular language for people to speak. A lot of people, young people we know, have Japanese given names. Is strong. The physical therapy lab that I go to, the center that I go to, has older women who are still speaking to each other in Japanese. So that legacy remains. And perhaps most importantly and most obviously is the legacy of Latin in Europe. You may have heard of the Romance languages. This is not meaning the words that express romance, although that certainly may be true of Italian and French. But what it means is languages that came from Roman, in other words, came from Latin. And these are languages that include, of course, French and Italian, also Spanish, Romansh in language probably none of you have ever heard of unless you come from Switzerland. It's one of the Swiss languages that actually takes the name of Roman language, and many others. But more important than that is the way in which, and this gets into a second legacy, and that is culture and science, the way in which Latin survives in many, many ways. So that we have it, Latin as the language of the law, and so many legal terms. Rebus stantibus, things remaining as they were, is one. So many words that are legal, law related or related to the law. Many words in English, ad hoc, agenda, and many, many others. Many footnotes, ibid, comes from Latin. The Latin stays on as a language, as does the derivative languages, we might call them in polite term vulgar languages or local languages remain. And some of these languages remain the common language, the lingua franca, by the way, another Latin term, the lingua franca of other areas of life. So you have it in music. Much of it is Italian. Think of presto, vivace, presto ma non troppo, fast but not that fast. And in French, in ballet, the common language, the lingua franca is French. Pas de deux and plié, the steps, the movements together, all are still straight from French. So these Romance languages continue on. When I was in hospital in University of Virginia, recovering from an appendectomy, I saw this strange abbreviation written by the nurses on a whiteboard at the foot of my bed, and it said NPO. And I said, "What does that mean?" And one of the nurses says, "You cannot take any medicine by mouth, only by injection." And I said, "But how does it say that?" And it was explained to me, and I won't get the Latin exactly right, but it's null, none, per, through, and then the Latin term, which I forget, for the Latin origin of oral, mouth. Nothing through the mouth, NPO, a straight Latin abbreviation, still in American contemporary medicine today. So these languages stay on and are extremely important. Either the derivatives of words that come from Latin or straight copy of Latin into English and in other languages, especially in law, especially in science, and especially through the Romance languages, through many other areas as well. I don't know how many of you here at Zhengda have participated in any of our wonderful university social responsibility programs with some of our local high schools in some of the areas of the city that are not so prosperous. Many of them, of course, home to new Taiwanese from Southeast Asia and other areas around us. I went there and they asked me, what is the most useful foreign language you have ever spoken? Because the foreign language that they were being encouraged to teach and learn, this was before the attempt to make Taiwan a multilingual society, a bilingual society. They were being encouraged to learn English, and many were resisting, saying, well, wait a minute, we're the sons and daughters of Vietnamese or Cambodians, and why shouldn't we speak those languages? Why English? So they asked me, I'm not sure what they wanted me to say or to expect me to say, but what I said was, which shocked them, I said, in addition to Chinese, which of course is my professional language, it's Latin. And they could not understand why. It's a dead language. No, it's not actually a dead language. It remains very much alive in very surprising places to a degree that's hard to imagine. That is one of the most important legacies of that particular empire. Other things that come from empires are basically the legacy of empire itself. My friend Krishan Kumar has talked about how important the Roman Empire was, not only in architecture, it's the source of so much of civic architecture around the world. If you want to take a look at the what is now the National Guest House across from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. That used to be the Governor General's residence. Governor General's residence is a kind of a Meiji version of Georgian, British imperial architecture. This is a version of neoclassical, kind of French version of architecture. So it's not only in architecture, but also in, I mentioned other forms of culture, but the Roman Empire was also the model for future empires. Krishan has written his book about and talked to me privately, given lectures about how the Roman Empire remains the model. And for some surprising countries, not only did Mussolini try to reconstruct a second Roman Empire, thus his invasion of Ethiopia, the creation, maybe this was before Mussolini, but the creation of Italian, what would we call it? not a treaty port, but a zone within that port of Tianjin, which still has a concession within that, and still has Italian-style architecture in it. Mussolini wanted to do more, wanted to recreate the Roman Empire. Recreating an empire is something we'll come back to when we get to the more negative aspects of empire. And so Rome has been the model for many, many others, including, most surprisingly, and Krishan has convinced me, because there's architectural evidence for it, the Roman Empire. That basically so many powerful states then, and maybe not that recently, but certainly through the 1920s and 30s, saw themselves as the inheritor of Rome still. In the same way that some of the Eastern Roman Empire places, and like the Holy Roman Empire, most notably, saw themselves as successors. And he's convinced me that Stalin saw, as implausible as it may seem, the Soviet Union as the new Rome. How do we see that? We see it in architecture. The Russians had created, in that burst of creativity towards the end of the Russian Empire, they created marvelous modern architecture. And some of the most exciting ideas in architecture came from Russian architects. Of course, they had the problem in Stalin's eyes. Many of them were Jewish, which was not the best thing in his point of view. But above all, they were modern. And so basically, when the debate was, what architectural forms will we create? Stalin said, none of that modern stuff. We are going to recreate, reutilize Roman neoclassical architecture. And the version, if any of you have been to Moscow, any of you have seen pictures of Moscow, does the name or the label Stalinist wedding cake mean anything to you? These extraordinarily high-rise buildings, many of them were for ministries. Yeah, pardon?
Seven Sisters.
Yes, exactly, the Seven Sisters, all in this over-the-top adaptation of neoclassical architecture in a society that, of course, had its own Russian traditions, some of which are, of course, replicated or still present in Red Square in particular. And modern architecture, some of which still exists, was influential around the world, but not for Stalin. He wanted to be the new Rome. Others have been more clear-cut about it, but he did it in an architectural style. So that's another legacy that has posed perhaps some problems over the years. But I want to get into the ones that are more commonly discussed now and are more serious. We can talk about the positive ones. I mentioned several of them. We can talk about infrastructure. If any of you take the red line out, go past over the river, past the Yushan stop on the red line, then you will note that the red line starts going up onto an elevated structure. And again, only if you're an old person like me, do you know what it is on top of? Anybody know? What was underneath? Why is it built on top of that? What was there before? The Japanese railway was there. That was where the northbound line went. Also, it went southbound. It went right through Ximending. That used to be a railroad crossing with gates that would come down. I'm old enough to remember that as well. Before that went underground. And basically, in the Japanese railway north of the city went above ground. And if you want to see the proof of that, go out to the wonderfully funky little connecting line, the shuttle, from Beito to Shinbeito, and go to the old Japanese railroad station, which still has examples of the Japanese trains that would bring visitors and tourists to Shinbeito to enjoy the hot springs. The Japanese railroad cars are still there. The station is still there. And they create these infrastructures that sometimes take different form, but are a positive aspect of things, while at the same time, they link very deliberately those places to the metropolis of the empire. And therefore, one can ask the question of how can we relate the Belt and Road Initiative of China to the idea of the formation and the form that not necessarily direct empires, formal empires occupied in previous periods in our history and more contemporary ones as well. So basically, the legacy of empire has some good features, some positive features, but it obviously has some very exploitative and even evil features. The role of empires, especially the British, perhaps most notably the Belgian in the Belgian Congo, the private property of the King of Belgium, Leopold at that time, not even a colony of Belgium or the Belgian king, but a personal property of the Belgian monarch, which was one of the most gruesome and oppressive of those. Another one was the part of the French Empire, Haiti, which was not only poorly run at the time, but once it became independent, the price that the French imposed on the new independent Haiti was a long-term loan that they would have to pay for their independence. And I forget when that loan is to be paid off. All I know is it's not yet. And if you want to know why Haiti is such a poor country, it's because so much of its wealth is still flowing back to the colonial metropole as the price of its independence. So you have the economic, you have the moral, the role of the imperial centers in the slave trade, including to, of course, the United States. These are some of the negative. As were more kind of less obvious but more equally damaging economic costs. And in addition to that, however, we are increasingly beginning to look at, and this is how I've gotten more interested in it, where I say the complex legacy of empires, some of the psychological or political psychological consequences of the empires. We all know, and I think we probably have all read books about the way in which empires were seen by the colonized as a profoundly humiliating and I'll just leave it at that, humiliating and offensive impact on their sense of identity. Perhaps the Indians in British India came up with that first. But almost everywhere we have seen that sense of it, a sense of having been humiliated, their cultures unappreciated, perhaps some efforts at cultural, we would now call cultural genocide, elimination of their language, and a general sense of humiliation. It's absolutely fascinating to, in all of these examples I'm giving, is to look for counterexamples. And my favorite here is Vietnam. Anybody here from Vietnam? So I think the flow of people to Taiwan from our new southbound policy is beginning to diminish. I'm very sorry to see that. But Shirley and I have been to Vietnam a number of times, and the one word we never ever hear in Vietnam is national humiliation, ever. And I've asked Vietnamese friends about this, and they say, because we were never humiliated. Well, you were occupied you were a French colony. You were occupied by the Chinese. You were controlled by the Americans. You were part of all of these empires. And so many other former imperial dependencies say they were humiliated. No, we weren't. We just knew there might be a long time, but eventually they would get tired and go away, and we would become Vietnam again. And when I asked them about that, when I said the most friendly greeting I've ever gotten was on my first visit to Vietnam, with students just talking about the future of Asia. And I said, we need a community in which you will all lead. And they all said, no, that's not going to work. It's a bad idea. It won't work. You need a leader. I said, really? And yes, we need a leader. And I said, well, who should that leader be? And they looked at me like, you should know. And I said, do you mean China? Oh, absolutely not. There is a memory, not of humiliation, but of disdain. Not the Chinese at all. Don't you understand this won't work if you Americans don't lead it? And I said, well, wait a minute, didn't we have a war here And they said, yeah, it was a war, and we won. We always win them eventually when the invader gets tired and goes away. So we don't feel humiliated. It's a war that meets that classic definition: if you don't win as the occupying power, you lose. So the Americans lost because they didn't win. And so the Vietnamese just say the Americans, well, compared to all the others, weren't that bad. And so, and one of them actually said, don't you understand, in America, we all want to be the 51st state. And that one really blew my mind. And I'm sure that did not reflect opinion from the central government or the party. But the point is that the psychological response to this humiliation and the exploitation and all the other evils of empire may not be universal. And it's one of the fascinating questions to ask in a comparative study of empires. The one that I want to talk about most, however, is the current one. And that is the sense that empires have been doing, in a sense, psychological damage, not only to the ruled, to the colonized, but to the colonizers. And that is because, basically, as we all know, imperialism and colonialism have become dirty words. So the worst you can say about a country or a movement is that it is neo-imperial or neo-colonial. So while the anti-colonial impact on the colonizers and the colonized may vary, greater in some places than others, it's only been recently that the colonizers have been made to have their feelings of regret, of guilt, and of some sort of need for apology and reparation. This is difficult for the colonizer as well. The other reason I got interested in this topic, and that'll bring us more down to the present and also indirectly closer to home, was, of course, the war in Ukraine. Here we have a former empire, not just the Russian, but also the Soviet Empire, modeled, as I said, by Stalin in bizarre ways after Rome, that basically fell apart with the end of the Cold War, with so many of the subordinate countries, even though some of them were nominally independent, like the Baltic states or Ukraine even, as members of a union of Soviet socialist republics, were of course under the control of the Soviet Union, both through party connections and, if necessary, military connections. Here we have the empire breaking apart. Again, the result of the loss of power from a foreign force, that is the Cold War and the United States. This produces two sentiments. And again, we have to go back and thank Latin and the Romance languages for the words that we use. Two words from French diplomacy. One is, and one actually even closer to Latin, irredentism, the sense of lost territory, and we want it back. Again, not all empires that have lost territory want it back. One of the other recent formative things that happened that led me to start thinking about this was from a Spanish friend of ours, a very distinguished female economist, which some of you may know, who, when we were talking about Taiwan and about why the Chinese want it back, she sort of sniffed and said, we Spanish, when our Spanish Empire, controlled Portugal for longer than the Qing dynasty controlled Taiwan. And we're not asking for it back. So basically, why is China asking for it back? We have lost territory too, but we're not making irredentist claims. The British are not making irredentist claims on the United States. Japan is not making an irredentist claim on Taiwan. Why is China making an irredentist claim on Taiwan? Now, we can talk about why it is. The simple answer to me is that its enemy in the Civil War that it thought it had defeated came to Taiwan and established a second life and has been extremely successful in many ways. But I think that still you can ask the question, as some are asking, if Taiwan, why not Mongolia? Why not parts of the Soviet Union? How do you pick and choose the irredenta that you really want back so badly that you're willing to go to war for it? And this is a question that, again, we'll have to go down case by case. But the idea that it's not just the colonized who were humiliated, but it's now the colonizers who were humiliated, and have, in addition to the irredentist claims, another marvelous word from some kind of variant of Latin in the word of diplomacy, revanchism. Very almost literally, the desire for revenge. We want not only to take it back, but we want the person who caused us to lose it to suffer and be humiliated just as we were. And so I think this is a large element of not only Russian, but also to a degree Chinese diplomacy. It wants Taiwan back, and I've heard Chinese put it this way, we want the United States to know its place. In other words, no longer the hegemon, no longer the most powerful country in this region. In fact, by the way, the United States is not even an Asian country, which is why the United States has had to basically talk about new definitions of regions. First the Asia-Pacific, now the Indo-Pacific, to bring more countries in to make it easier to counterbalance or to deter China. So these are some of the legacies of empire, both the positive ones that I've talked about in the arts, in language, in culture, in science. One thing I didn't mention is higher education. There's a very interesting book written by William Kirby, the former dean of the, I think the College of Arts and Sciences at Harvard, called Empires of Ideas. And I'll end on this point because we'll get even more specifically about some lessons that Taiwan might learn from all of this, other than understanding why the Chinese want us back so badly. One of the things that empires also do is to create new models of higher education and new ideas that come out from inquiry, study, and contemplation, and research, and dialogue. Bill Kirby's book is called The Empire of Ideas, and it is about the various models of higher education that have been developed across the world, starting with the model that became the research unit. I'm sorry, it didn't start. It started with the model in Britain, which is basically the liberal college university, whose main model is basically dialogue, the seminar, and the honors dissertation under the advisory of a chief mentor. That's the British model. Dialogue, critical thinking, creative thinking. The next model was the German model, which was basically the model of scientific research, more systematic, more quantitative, and more focused on science, technology, and engineering. The third model, he says, was the United States, which was an adaptation of the British model of higher education, but one that became much more universal in the country that adopted it. The British still today is very largely a higher education system for the wealthy and the elite. The American very early on became a higher education system for everyone. And that was the idea that the founder of my university, the University of Virginia, believed in very deeply, that it should be, the University of Virginia should be for all. And the purpose was, above all, to create informed citizens. And basically, if you're a democracy, you need informed citizens, not just informed rulers. As he put it in a letter to a friend, that what he wanted at the University of Virginia, to create a situation in which, as he said, citizens will be engaged in the practice of governance, in other words, politics, not just once a year on election day, but every day. In other words, really believed in a populist model of democracy, participatory democracy, totally impractical in a large country in particular, but having that idea that we need educated citizens and therefore all citizens need to be educated. And thus the growth of systems of higher education for all, Some, at this point in time, work better than others. I think higher education, especially to plug my now new home state, the University of Virginia, which has everything from not just the ones that you've heard about, like the University of Virginia, or if you know the history of Taiwan and the Taiwanese Republic of China military, you'll know the role of VMI, Virginia Military Institute, in the history of the ROC Army. And if you don't, ask people who know Taiwanese history, military history, who that is and how his home is right, I guess not right down the street from here, right down the street from Shirley's old office, which is now a beautiful coffee house and restaurant using a Japanese-style home, again, the Japanese architectural legacy. And VMI and Virginia Tech, which probably more of you have heard of, University of Virginia, William and Mary College, the one that Thomas Jefferson was graduated from. All of these places, an enormously varied, richly varied higher education system, all based on the idea of education for all. So coming down to the most controversial thing that he says in his book, Bill Ashby, is that the next model, the next empire of ideas will be China. And the Chinese universities will become the model for the rest of the world. I don't really know why he says that. I really cannot comprehend it. Accepting that the idea that for countries that want to have authoritarian systems in which scholars simply do their academic research and don't say anything politically sensitive or politically controversial, that model, which comes, by the way, from the Singaporean model, where you have scholars doing nothing but writing academic articles written for other academics. So you're pretty much ensured that they're not going to say anything that's going to arouse the masses or even other non-specialist intellectuals. That is the Chinese model. We could call it the Singaporean model, which is where I first encountered it, was I was told with a straight face that we don't worry about our scholars getting into trouble because we have a clear legal precedent that anything that is published in a refereed academic journal will not be accused of libel, which of course is the standard Singaporean legal way of getting at a critic. You're libeling the ruling party or the head of state or government. So this is the way. You just write for other academics. A refereed journal, if it gets adopted, it must be true. I don't know how many people have tried to challenge that, so we'll write something that can pass referee, but we'll still be critical of the government. Don't know whether anybody's been brave enough to try, but that is what I see as the Chinese model. But basically, the title of the book is even more important to me, and this will get us to a final point that's relevant to Taiwan, is the empire of ideas. What he was really talking about, of course, in his book was the empire of universities, of higher educational institutions. So why did he call it the empire of ideas? Because societies that have well-endowed, well-supported, and free and open universities do present various kinds of ideas along with the cultural products that we have already mentioned. And so let me give the example of that, just very close to home, from Shirley's visit to Vienna. And two things happened there. One was she was staying at a very nice hotel, but she was interested in saying, what else can I do in the neighborhood? What else can I do in Vienna? So in addition to doing some of the more standard things that you do, go to see the big grand museums that were established by the Austrian Empire, the Habsburg Empire, was Habsburg, wasn't it? I think it was Habsburg, the final empire, and the museums and the libraries and so forth. She went to a relatively modest, what was it, a two-story building, three-story building, two-story, and walked up to the second floor, one of these places with a standard, kind of walk-up modest building with apartments on various sides of that floor. And in a small apartment over to the right, there was this very elegantly worded, elegantly drafted sign that simply said, Dr. Freud. And that was the office of Sigmund Freud, where he interviewed his patients and invented psychoanalysis and psychotherapy. Invented it in that room that still has his name on the door. Shirley then discovered a book and brought it home, and it's called The City of Ideas, which is basically that Vienna was, as the metropolitan center of the empire, not only a place of music and culture and art and architecture, but also of other ideas like psychotherapy, lots of ideas about economics, lots of ideas about politics. And she's come back thinking, and only the others of you who are either new Taiwanese or real Taiwanese can advise us on whether you think it's possible. Can Taipei also become a city of ideas where it can begin to punch above its weight as a small country but is free and with a freedom to develop new ideas in the same way that some other countries? We've been, so last point about Taiwan and Taipei is in several trips recently, we've talked about this issue. And again, people have come up with this, I hope familiar to this, to you term from boxing. In boxing, the fighters are classified as punching or regarded as punching below their weight or above their weight. In other words, if you are a heavyweight boxer, you are expected to win, almost every battle because you're the biggest, you're the heaviest weight, therefore you should be the strongest. If you don't do that well, then you are punching below your weight. Conversely, if you are a lighter weight boxer but are beating bigger people, now we have to say women as well as men because boxing has become a multi-sex, multi-gender sport, then you're punching above your weight. And so we've been talking about countries that punch above or below their weights. We can think of Singapore, a country, as a small country that is punched above its weight. Switzerland, a country that is punched above its weight in so many ways, a center for much technology, starting with watches, a center for finance, for private banking, and many other smaller countries. Monaco, a very small country that has become the center still for very high class gambling. So there are countries that punch above their weight. Singapore, I think, the best example of that because it is the leader of ASEAN de facto, even though some other countries may share it. It punches above its weight because of the power of its ideas and its scholarship and its analysis. Taiwan, I'm sorry to say, still punches below its weight. It punches below its weight, although I see good signs of change in comparison with Korea. Korea punches way above its weight with regard to popular culture. How many Korean video dramas are you binge watching right at the moment? Because they are really, really good. And to talk about empire of ideas or cities of idea, they're organized around one big idea that actually maybe comes as much from Vienna as it does from Seoul, and that's class struggle. So many of these Netflix classics are all about class struggle, ranging from some of the early ones which were more directed by or produced by Koreans. My favorite, because I love trains, the Snowpiercer, about this class-divided huge train, which is deep luxury in first class and basically a jail in the what's it called, in the caboose. The last car in the train, class struggle kind of waged there. And Parasite is probably the most important single movie of this theme. But there is a country that is becoming a country of culture and a country of ideas. So I'll leave you with this challenge to think about, first of all, the way in which Japan has had a lasting impact on Taiwan and how you would evaluate that mixed impact. Everything from architecture to the railway system to some still aspects of language and culture. The way in which that's controversial. One last personal story. When I first lived in Taiwan studying at Taida, I rented an apartment that was a very typical Japanese apartment that had a separate tatami room that was walled off by sliding screens. I remember one was a Fusama screen and one was a shoji screen. Absolutely beautiful. We never used it to sleep in, but it was there and was a part of the beautiful layout of the building. Some of our friends from China who had come here, obviously after 1945, walked into this, stared at that piece of architecture, and without saying anything other than what I will quote them as saying, made their point. We would never live here. We would never live here. That's Japanese. Get rid of it. So these are how some of the legacies of empire are reflected, and then the attitudes that the imperial experience or the colonial experience is reflected. But we also see, beside those more negative and difficult consequences, the desire for revenge, the need to reclaim lost territory. We also have some of these other interesting ideas about even small countries, if they can be cities of ideas or empires of ideas, they can punch above their weight. So the challenge for, I think, Taiwanese, especially younger Taiwanese, is, are there models from the rise, the fall, and the survival of empires and their former colonies and dependencies and territories? Are there lessons for Taiwan? And we'll leave it at that. Thanks very much. And I think we have time for questions and comments, and I look forward to that with particular pleasure. Thank you.